Here is the paradox. The United States has spent billions of dollars building the most sophisticated financial sanctions architecture in history. It has blacklisted hundreds of vessels, designated dozens of entities, and threatened secondary sanctions against any bank or company that touches Iranian oil. And right now, as you watch this, 20 million barrels of that oil are sitting in tankers off the coast of Malaysia, fully loaded, waiting to be sold, and almost nobody is going to stop them. That is not a failure of intelligence. The ships are being tracked. Kepler, Vortexa, and other commodity data firms know exactly where they are. The U.S. Treasury knows. The State Department knows. The paradox is not that the fleet is hidden.
The paradox is that the infrastructure enabling it, the ship-to-ship transfers, the flag changes, the Malaysian port ecosystem, the insurance workarounds, the Chinese state-owned refineries on the other end, is operating largely in plain sight, and it is operating because Beijing has made a deliberate strategic decision to let it operate. Tonight, I want to follow the money, not the political headlines, the actual financial architecture that moves sanctioned oil from Iranian wells to Chinese refineries via a Malaysian waypoint, and show you who is getting rich at every step and why this same inherited infrastructure is now being used by Russia, Venezuela, and North Korea to run their own versions of the same play.
I have spent years tracing how sanctioned commodities move through the global financial system. Not the official channels, but the shadow plumbing that connects state-owned enterprises, offshore registries, and correspondent banking networks. What the forensic record shows is that every major sanctions regime in the past 30 years has produced the same outcome: a shadow market that emerges within 18 to 24 months, prices the sanctions discount into the commodity, and generates significant profit for the intermediaries willing to operate in the gray zone. The Iranian shadow fleet is not an anomaly. It is the template. One sentence. The 20 million barrels sitting off Malaysia are not evidence that Iran is evading sanctions. They are evidence that China has built a parallel oil trading infrastructure specifically designed to make Western sanctions unenforceable, and that Beijing is now licensing that infrastructure to every state Washington is trying to pressure. To understand why this shadow fleet exists, you need to understand what it is responding to. The United States built its sanctions power on a single structural advantage: the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. Because most international commodity transactions are denominated in dollars, they pass through the U.S. correspondent banking system at some point. And because they pass through that system, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, has the legal authority to block, freeze, or penalize any transaction it designates as sanctionable. That architecture worked extremely well when it was deployed against smaller economies with limited alternatives. It worked against Iran in the early 2010s, when Chinese banks still depended heavily on dollar correspondent relationships and could not afford to be cut off from the U.S. financial system. The JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, was in significant part a product of that financial pressure. The sanctions worked because China complied. What Beijing observed from that experience was not reassurance. It was a vulnerability. The lesson Chinese financial planners drew from watching Iran capitulate under dollar-denominated pressure was that any country, including China itself, could be brought to its knees if Washington chose to weaponize the dollar system aggressively enough. The shadow infrastructure you are watching operate off Malaysia today is the direct institutional response to that lesson. It is the poisoned inheritance of dollar dominance. A system so powerful it eventually motivates its targets to build an alternative. Now let us follow the money through the actual mechanism. Iranian crude loads at a terminal in Karg Island or Bandar Abbas. The tanker, almost certainly not flying the Iranian flag, registered instead under the flag of a Pacific island nation, Panama, or a jurisdiction with minimal oversight, transits the Indian Ocean and approaches the Strait of Malacca. Off the Malaysian coast, typically in the waters between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, the tanker conducts a ship-to-ship transfer with a second vessel. This transfer is the operational heart of the evasion. The oil moves from the Iranian origin tanker to a second ship with a cleaner paper trail. The receiving vessel's documentation will show its cargo as Malaysian or Middle Eastern crude of unspecified origin, a category that Malaysian port authorities have for years been willing to certify without scrutiny.
Size. The Malaysian port ecosystem that enables this is not incidental. Specific terminals along the Strait of Malacca have developed significant expertise in what the shipping industry calls blending operations, mixing crude oils of different origins to obscure the provenance of the final product. According to data tracked by Kepler and reported by Reuters, ship-to-ship transfer volumes in Malaysian waters increased substantially between 2019 and 2025, correlating directly with the reimposition of U.S. sanctions after the JCPOA withdrawal. That correlation is not coincidence, it is causation. The receiving vessel then proceeds to a Chinese port, most commonly Shandong Province's independent refineries, known in the industry as teapots, which are privately owned, operate outside the formal state-owned enterprise system, and have significantly less exposure to Western financial compliance requirements. The oil arrives. It gets refined. It enters the Chinese domestic market or gets re-exported as refined product. The paper trail at this point shows no Iranian origin.
Now the part that almost nobody covers, the financial intermediary layer. Because moving sanctioned oil is not just operationally complex, it is extraordinarily profitable for the people who do it. Iranian crude sells at a discount to market price, historically between $10 and $25 per barrel below Brent, depending on the intensity of sanctions enforcement at any given moment. That discount is not a loss to Iran in the accounting sense. Iran is still selling oil it would otherwise not be able to sell at all. The discount is the fee Iran pays to the intermediary infrastructure for taking the compliance risk. That intermediary fee flows to several places.
The tanker operators who run the shadow fleet, registered through layers of shell companies in the Marshall Islands, the Cook Islands, and other flag of convenience registries, charge freight rates significantly above market for sanctionable cargo. The blending terminals in Malaysia charge a premium for their obscuring function. The trading desks that arrange the transactions, typically operating out of Dubai, Hong Kong, or Singapore, in the legal gray zone between Western compliance jurisdictions and Chinese market access, take a spread on every cargo. A back-of-envelope calculation using publicly available data illustrates the scale. 20 million barrels at a $10 discount is $200 million of intermediary value in a single fleet sitting off one coast. Multiply that by the estimated annual volume of Iranian shadow exports, which commodity analysts at Kepler have tracked at between 1 and 1.5 million barrels per day in recent years, and you are looking at an intermediary economy worth several billion dollars annually. That money does not appear in any sanctions enforcement report. It does not get seized. It circulates through a parallel financial architecture that Western regulators have enormous difficulty reaching.
China's role in this system is not passive tolerance. It is active architecture. Chinese state policy has made several deliberate choices that enable the shadow fleet to function. First, Beijing has declined to join Western secondary sanctions regimes. Chinese banks that process payments for Iranian oil transactions do so knowing that OFAC has limited practical ability to enforce penalties against major Chinese financial institutions without triggering a financial conflict with Beijing that Washington has consistently been unwilling to start. The implicit threat of secondary sanctions exists. The actual enforcement against major Chinese state-owned banks has been minimal. Second, Beijing has encouraged the development of yuan-denominated oil trading infrastructure.
The Shanghai International Energy Exchange launched yuan-denominated crude futures, specifically to provide an alternative settlement mechanism that bypasses SWIFT and the dollar correspondent banking system. Iranian oil can now be sold, priced, and settled in yuan, meaning the transaction never touches a channel where OFAC has jurisdiction. Third, and most consequentially, China has allowed its independent Shandong refineries, the teapot sector, to absorb sanctioned crude from multiple origins without applying the compliance standards that would be required of state-owned enterprises. This is not an oversight. It is a policy choice. The teapot refinery sector processes an estimated 35 to 40% of China's total crude imports. It is too large and too economically significant for Beijing to shut down. And Beijing has no incentive to do so when the crude it is buying costs $20 a barrel less than the market alternative.
Here is what the headline coverage consistently fails to connect. The Malaysian shadow fleet is not an Iranian-specific story. It is a shared infrastructure story. And the other clients of that infrastructure tell you exactly how significant the strategic stakes are. Russian crude, following the Western price cap and sanctions regime imposed after the 2022 Ukraine invasion, began moving through shadow fleet infrastructure with remarkable speed. According to tracking data compiled by Kepler and the Financial Times, the number of aging tankers operating without Western insurance, what analysts call the dark fleet, expanded from roughly 200 vessels in early 2022 to over 600 by late 2023. Many of these vessels use ship-to-ship transfer protocols in the same Malaysian and Indonesian waters where Iranian transfers occur. The operational template is identical because, in many cases, the operators are the same.
Venezuelan crude, under U.S. sanctions since 2019, uses a variant of the same mechanism. Ship-to-ship transfers in Caribbean and West African waters, flag changes, blending operations, and final delivery to Chinese and other Asian refiners. North Korean coal and mineral exports, sanctioned under UN Security Council resolutions, move through similar shadow logistics networks with Chinese complicity at the receiving end. What you are looking at, forensically, is not a collection of separate evasion schemes. It is a single emerging parallel trade architecture, built initially around Iranian oil, stress-tested and refined over 20 years of sanctions pressure, and now available as a service to any commodity exporter that Washington is trying to isolate. Beijing did not build this architecture for altruistic reasons. It built it because having a functional alternative to the dollar-denominated trading system gives China strategic leverage it did not previously possess.
The final piece of the architecture, and the one with the most direct financial implications, is the insurance and banking layer that makes it all work. Every commercial tanker needs insurance to operate. Traditionally, that insurance was provided by the P&I clubs, protection and indemnity clubs, which are the mutual insurers that cover roughly 90% of global shipping. Most major P&I clubs are headquartered in the United Kingdom or other Western jurisdictions, and are subject to OFAC compliance requirements. They cannot insure vessels carrying sanctioned cargo. So the shadow fleet insures itself elsewhere. Russian state insurer Ingostrak has provided coverage for Russian shadow fleet vessels.
Iranian vessels carry insurance from domestic Iranian insurers of limited credibility in international port disputes. Some vessels carry no verifiable insurance at all, which creates enormous tail risk if an accident occurs, and which responsible port authorities in jurisdictions with environmental liability frameworks should, in theory, refuse to allow. Malaysian port authorities have, in practice, applied these standards with significant flexibility. The financial incentive is direct and traceable. The ship-to-ship transfer economy generates port fees, anchorage fees, bunker fuel sales, crew provisioning revenues, and related economic activity for the coastal communities and port operators that host it. Estimating conservatively from publicly available Malaysian port statistics and known transfer volumes, the economic value of the shadow transfer economy to specific Malaysian port communities runs into hundreds of millions of dollars annually. That is why enforcement is lax. Not because Malaysian authorities do not know what is happening, because they do know, and the money is too good to stop.
Washington faces a genuine trilemma here. Option 1. Enforce secondary sanctions aggressively against Chinese banks and Malaysian entities that participate in the shadow infrastructure. This would be the most direct way to shut down the mechanism. It would also trigger a significant escalation in U.S.-China economic relations, at a moment when Washington is already managing trade tensions, technology competition, and Taiwan. The cost of enforcement may exceed the benefit of the oil disruption it achieves. Option 2. Accept that the Iranian sanctions regime is effectively broken and negotiate a new framework that acknowledges Iran's actual oil export volumes as a baseline fact rather than a target for elimination. This is politically nearly impossible given domestic U.S. constraints, but is arguably the only approach that could produce a durable agreement.
Option 3, and the one Washington has been pursuing, is selective enforcement, designating individual vessels and entities, applying penalties at the margins, maintaining the legal architecture of the sanctions regime while accepting that its economic impact has been substantially degraded by the shadow infrastructure. This preserves the political optics of pressure while accepting its practical limitations. It also preserves the intermediary economy, which means the people getting rich off the discount continue to get rich, and the infrastructure continues to develop.
Scenario 1. The shadow infrastructure continues to expand. Chinese yuan-denominated oil trading volume increases. More commodity exporters under sanctions adopt the Malaysian waypoint model, and the dollar-denominated sanctions architecture loses another 10 to 15 percentage points of effective coverage over the next 5 years. This is the current trajectory. It does not require any dramatic event. It just requires continuation of existing trends. Scenario 2. A U.S.-China financial confrontation triggers an aggressive enforcement push. Washington designates major Chinese state-owned banks under secondary sanctions. China retaliates by accelerating de-dollarization of its commodity trade, and global oil markets bifurcate into a dollar zone and a yuan zone. Oil prices diverge between the two systems. Western refiners face supply disruption.
The financial shock is significant and distributed globally, hitting energy-importing economies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America hardest. Scenario 3. A major environmental incident involving an uninsured shadow fleet vessel creates political pressure for enforcement. A tanker casualty in Malaysian or Indonesian waters involving significant oil spill damage forces the question of liability and insurance coverage into the legal system in ways that expose the entire infrastructure to scrutiny. Historically, shipping disasters have been among the most effective catalysts for regulatory reform in the maritime sector. Scenario 4. The parallel infrastructure becomes formalized. China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela establish a formal alternative commodity trading framework, possibly anchored to BRICS financial architecture, that prices oil in a basket currency, uses non-SWIFT settlement, and explicitly refuses Western sanctions jurisdiction. At that point, the shadow fleet stops being a shadow. It becomes a competing system. Several elements of this scenario are already in motion.
If you are finance-minded, here is the direct implication of everything I just showed you. The sanctions discount on Iranian crude is a persistent structural feature of global oil markets, not a temporary anomaly. As long as the shadow infrastructure functions, Iranian oil will trade at a discount to Brent, and that discount will flow to intermediaries in the trading, shipping, and banking layer. Those intermediaries operate primarily in Dubai, Hong Kong, Singapore, and certain Malaysian port communities. The money is real, it is large, and it is not going away.
Pause. For energy markets more broadly, the existence of a shadow supply of 1 to 1.5 million barrels per day of Iranian crude that is not fully captured in official supply statistics creates a persistent downward bias on global oil prices relative to what they would be if sanctions were fully enforced. This matters for everyone from pension funds with energy sector exposure to governments whose fiscal calculations depend on oil price assumptions. And for the dollar system specifically, the gradual expansion of yuan-denominated oil settlement is a slow-moving but structurally significant development. It does not threaten dollar dominance in the short term, but every barrel of Iranian crude that settles in yuan is a data point in a longer trend. The financial architecture that has given Washington its most powerful geopolitical tool is being quietly, deliberately, and profitably dismantled. And the people doing the dismantling are getting paid very well for the work.
Let me bring this together. 20 million barrels of Iranian oil off the coast of Malaysia is not primarily a story about Iran. It is a story about the systematic construction of a parallel global trade infrastructure, built by Beijing, stress-tested on Iranian crude, and now extended to Russia, Venezuela, and North Korea, that is designed from the ground up to make the dollar-denominated sanctions system unenforceable. The money flows are traceable, the intermediaries are identifiable. The Malaysian port ecosystem that enables the transfers is documented in satellite data and commodity tracking reports available to any analyst with a Bloomberg terminal. The infrastructure is not hidden. It is operating in plain sight because the one country with the financial power to shut it down, China, has made a sovereign decision that maintaining it serves its strategic interests more than dismantling it would.
The poisoned inheritance of dollar dominance is that the system powerful enough to bring Iran to the table in 2015 was also visible enough to motivate Beijing to spend a decade building the architecture that makes it optional. Every sanctions regime produces its own evasion infrastructure. This one produced a shadow market worth billions annually and a parallel financial system that now serves as the plumbing for every state Washington is trying to isolate. Here is the question I want you to sit with. At what point does a sanctions regime that enriches intermediaries, funds shadow fleets, and incentivizes the construction of alternative financial infrastructure do more damage to American financial power than the behavior it is trying to punish? Drop your answer in the comments. The most financially rigorous responses I will read in the follow-up.